Right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Oblong Online. I am Noelle, and I'm so excited tonight to be hosting this event with James Romm and Daniel Mendelsohn. And before I introduce our guests tonight, we just have a couple of things to chat about. If all of you have not used Crowdcast before, it's super easy, not much to know. There is a chat box on the right side of your screen. If you have a question for later this evening towards the last quarter of the event, just type it in there and I'll see it and write it down and we'll get to your questions. There's also a ask a question box in the center bottom of your screen, so you can use that one too. There is a buy the book link on the bottom of the page if you want to buy James's book, and we encourage you to do that. And then also on the very top of the chat box, there's a little link for Libro.fm where you can purchase and download the audiobook of James Romm's book, which I'm listening to right now, and it's excellent. I'm a huge fan of audiobooks. So that's that, and let's get started. We're so delighted tonight to be hosting the James H. Ottaway Jr. Professor of Classics at Bard College, James Romm, with his new book, The Sacred Band, 300 Theban Lovers Fighting to Save Greek Freedom. James Romm's reviews and essays appear regularly in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Review of Books. He also oversees the ambitious Ancient Lives series recently launched by Yale University Press. And conducting our conversation tonight, we have another Hudson Valley local, Daniel Mendelsohn, a friend of Oblong, a recent contributor to the New Yorker and New York Review of Books, where he's editor-at-large. Daniel's books include Three Rings, A Tale of Exile, Narrative, and Fate, An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, and The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million, as well as 3 collections of essays and criticism. And he teaches also at Bard College in literature. I am so excited to hear about your book, James. Honestly, the audiobook is really riveting. I've been listening to it all week. It's so great. And welcome. So I will turn things over to Daniel.
Super. Thank you. Well, I have to say it's a personal pleasure to be here this evening talking to Jamie about his new book. And not only is he a close friend, but a respected colleague in the Bard Classics department. And it's been a great pleasure for me over many years now to watch all of these wonderful books come out. And so I guess, Jamie, I want to start with a question about the why of this book. So you've been writing books about classical history in particular for some time now, exploring subjects as different as the successors of Alexander the Great, the story of Seneca and Nero, which is a great parable of intellectual integrity under totalitarian rule that never stops being applicable. You've edited a collection of translations of Greek tragedy, and now The Sacred Band. I personally know a little bit about the genesis of this project, but I guess given the range of things that you're interested in, and I should also mention because Jamie and I were actually graduate students together many years ago at Princeton, where he wrote a fabulously interesting thesis, subsequently published as a book about ancient Greek ideas, particularly in Herodotus, about geography, exploration, the edges of the world. So you've sort of covered so many topics and are so wide-ranging. So what caught your eye about the Sacred Band story, and why did you decide this was the time that there needed to be a book about it?
Well, there's probably needed to be a book about it for a long time. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Noelle, for that introduction and for hosting this event. I love Oblong Books. I love going in there. You find so many wonderful things. Yeah, it's amazing that there hasn't been a book to this point, a serious study of not just the Sacred Band, but the whole period in which they were the primary battlefield weapon of Thebes, what's called the Theban hegemony, the time when Thebes was the superpower of Greece. It's very little known, very little written about. And that's partly to do with the sources, because Xenophon, who's our principal source for this period, did his best to cover this story up, because he hated the Thebans, and he hated the fact that they had beaten the Spartans, and he especially hated the Sacred Band because they were the principal weapon that had beaten the Spartans. And he tried his best to give them short shrift and say very little about them.
So clearly, I mean, as classicists, we know about that issue. I guess before, it's always hard for classicists to talk about these things because we know a lot, but I think maybe it would be helpful to the people listening to sort of sketch, that 40-year period that's the subject of your book. So I think a lot of people in the audience will know about Athens, the Golden Age of Athens, the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War is basically over at the end of the 5th century BCE. So maybe it would be helpful for people, before we talk specifically about the band, which I have very specific questions about, like the Peloponnesian War is over, Athens is defeated and crushed by the Spartans. What happens next? Like, there's a power vacuum, which is a story I know you're interested in other areas. So just sketch the period so people could then understand the role of the band.
Okay, yeah, so let's start with the end of the Peloponnesian War. So Sparta is victorious. It's led by one of the most aggressive expansionist kings in its history, a man named Agesilaus, and its power becomes hugely greater than it ever had been. And not only greater, but more aggressive, more oppressive to the other Greeks. And of course, Greeks being Greeks, and nobody could stand having someone bullying them around, and they very quickly lined up on the other side against Sparta, including Thebes, which had formerly been a Spartan ally. But now suddenly it sided with Athens and against Sparta, and the bond was broken. And that is really the start of the story. Sparta couldn't stand to have an ally like Thebes betray it. It occupied Thebes with military force, installed a pro-Spartan regime, put down all dissent, all attempt to keep Thebes democratic. And it was the take-back of Thebes from the Spartans that started the story of the Sacred Band. The Sacred Band were formed as a way to counter the Spartan moves against Thebes.
And so it's interesting. I mean, people maybe talk a little bit more. What's always interesting to me, so Jamie is much more of a historian than I am, and I worked on tragedy. And we were both at Princeton at a time when one of the faculty was theorizing about, Thebes as a kind of literary site. All Greek tragedy is from Athens, written in Athens for Athenians, but it's never about Athens. There's only one Greek tragedy set in Athens, or even partially, and most of them are set in Thebes. So Thebes is always the kind of other to Athens. But why do you think, I mean, aside from Xenophon, I think this story about the band in particular, which we'll get to in a second, Thebes is always taken second, if not third, probably third, because Sparta would be second, maybe, in the cultural imagination. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas about, I mean, I think your book will go a long way to repairing that, because it's an incredibly interesting moment, but I wonder just, why does Thebes, aside from Xenophon, get a kind of a bad rap, do you think? I mean, what is this place?
Well, it was partly really ethnic prejudice. The Thebans were Boeotian. They belonged to a subset of the Greek people called the Boeotians, and they spoke funny. They didn't have much of a literary tradition, and they liked food. They liked to eat, and they were not very intelligent in the Greek eyes anyway. The Greeks called them Boeotian swine. And they were thought to have really not much going for them. Not the moral rigor of Sparta and not the intellectual talents of Athens.
Right. It's an interesting, I mean, that itself, I think, is an interesting story. Okay, so let's get to the band. The elevator pitch. What's, we've mentioned it a few times, but who is the Sacred Band? How did it get formed? What are its special qualities? And why is it good to think about right now?
Well, the primary thing to know about the band is that they were formed of 150 male couples and stationed side by side so that the Erastes and the Eromenos, the older and younger members of the pair, were fighting side by side. The Thebans seem to have had one of the unique things about Thebes was its uniquely supportive culture of male homosexual bonding. Several authors, mostly Athenian authors, remark on this. And they drew on that tradition or that cultural pattern when they formed the band. They formed it out of male couples.
And so, I mean, I think most people have some sense that relationships between men were more or less par for the course throughout ancient Greece. You want to maybe situate Thebes in that tradition a little bit more. I mean, what was the general attitude? I'm going to come specifically to Xenophon and Agesilaus and some of that stuff later. But I mean, how does this Theban thing fit into the larger culture of male homosexuality, and how is it different or special within that?
Good. So Plato's Symposium is our best source for this, because that is a work that's almost exclusively concerned with male homosexual bonding. And Plato makes clear that Thebes was different than other places. The pairs were formed more naturally. You didn't have to work as hard to get a guy, and the relationships were more long-lasting. They were permanent. Xenophon even uses a word of them that is otherwise used of marriage. This was very rare in Athens. In fact, we only know of one couple who are represented in the symposium who stayed together throughout life. But at Thebes, that seems to have been the pattern. And also, the members of the pair were both adult, because to serve in the Sacred Band, you had to be of military age. So clearly, we're dealing with two adult males rather than an older and a younger, sometimes even prepubescent male.
Right. That it's interesting, and I think it's worth pointing out that the larger tradition is rather codified. This particular erotic institution. I always compare it to courtly love in the Middle Ages. That there's roles that are played, everyone expects it, so that the standard is an older man takes under his wing this much younger boy, and he's the instructor and the presumably the moral teacher, and he helps this much younger person become a man. And there is this erotic element. But that's why I think it's worth pointing out, apropos of the band, that this was special. And when you read Plato's Symposium, which is his great dialogue about desire and love, there's one couple that seemed to be, sort of a much more of a equivalent of like a modern gay two partners, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think people today necessarily understand that that's the outlier for the Greeks. They thought that was weird.
Yes.
Except in Thebes.
Right.
So I know that it's a bit shrouded in mystery, but how does it all begin?
How does the band get formed?
Well, one day somebody says, "Oh, let's have a, super elite fighting unit composed of couples."
That seems to have been what happened.
It's like,
a man named Gorgidas, who was one of the leaders of the Theban revolution. So Thebes took back its city from the Spartans in 379 on the day of the winter solstice, because that was the day when the Spartan junta, the ruling high command, were having a festival of Aphrodite. And a group of Thebans dressed up in women's clothes, pretended to be their sex partners, and then assassinated them. It was a miraculous event. It totally changed the equation of the balance of power in the Greek world. So directly after that expulsion, the Thebans realized they were going to get everything Sparta had. Sparta was going to come after them with everything it had, and they had to defend themselves. So Gorgidas, one of the leaders of the revolution, proposed this elite fighting force.
And so there's essentially a 40-year period in which this institution flourishes until the spectacular end, which we'll get to later. So what are they doing during this period? This period of Spartan, Theban supremacy. I mean, what are some of the signal achievements of the great sacred band? And what are other people thinking about them throughout Greece? We know that there's an allusion to it in the symposium.
That's right.
Actually, but so there's 40 years of these dazzling successes. And what are they, and why are they significant? And you might, Jamie, want to pull back a little, because Thebes' sudden rise to hegemony is part of a very elaborate international picture that's going on that involves not only the Spartans, but the Persians. Everyone's involved. So, maybe talk a little more fully about the period and what's at stake, and why this unit becomes so legendary.
So the Greeks were aware that they were in kind of a mess in the 4th century. Warfare was more or less constant, and the capacity for leadership was diminishing. Sparta had been the traditional leader, but they were growing weaker, and it wasn't clear whether they could still lead, or if not they, who. The Persian king got involved because he took the side of the Spartans and tried to craft a kind of general treaty framework, sort of like a UN charter, so that the Greeks could coexist and stop fighting each other. And that lasted for a couple of years, but then it broke down, and then there were other attempts. There were 6 different attempts in the space of about 10 years, and all of them failed. So the fighting went on. Thebes was finally able to win a decisive victory at Leuctra over Sparta in 371, destroying the myth that Sparta was the leader of Greece and that it could control events. And that turned the tide entirely. And the Thebans made 3 different invasions of the Peloponnese, a region that had been Spartan territory forever, for centuries. They were able to penetrate, invade, and create the city of Messene, build it from scratch, to house the freed slaves that had escaped from Sparta and were now free Greeks once again after centuries of servitude. Their people had been in centuries of servitude. So these events that happened in rapid succession in just 3 or 4 years totally changed the balance of power, so that Sparta was not capable of exerting its force outside the Peloponnese ever again.
So I guess people would, so this goes on for several decades. I guess a question before we get to Chaeronea, I've always had a question, just a sort of general question about Greek history, which is, you're describing, it's funny because, as I think I told you, last summer I read the Hellenica for the first time since I was an undergraduate. So the Xenophon, the Greek historian, who was a member of the circle of Socrates, and writes this history of his own times, essentially, political and military history called the Hellenica, which basically just means stuff about Greece. And I read it last year. In fact, I remember the drag party, the drag assassination episode. I kept checking my LSJ, my dictionary, to make sure I wasn't getting anything wrong, because it's such a wacky story. I was like, wait, what? You know. But I guess a question I've always wanted to just been interested in is, you know, you're just describing this period of internecine back and forth, these repeated attempts at a peace among these little Greek city-states, because part of the story of Chaeronea is also this story, which I'll get to in a little bit, about the end of classical Greece, in some sense. Why could they never get it together?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, it's just so much a part of the city-state culture of the classical age and the Greek temperament that no one was willing to listen to anybody else. You know, I mean, you might compare a group of old Jewish men sitting around a deli today and trying to come to agreement. I mean, there was just a combativeness that was central to the Greek nature. And whenever one city started to get an edge over the others would all team up against it. So they kept the scales fairly evenly balanced, and that meant constant warfare.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, because I was really struck as I read the Xenophon by the total tragedy of this century. And, you know, they were just never able to get it together. Cavafy, whom, you know, I have an interest in, has several poems about this sort of tragic inability to come together and do something, you know. And so this, I guess, leads naturally into two questions. Xenophon comes up a lot in your book. And so maybe people need to know more about Xenophon as a character, because he, you know, why is he so admiring of the Spartans? What do the Spartans represent? Why is, I mean, you've sketched why he's anti-Theban, because he loves the Spartans. But I think because it goes to this question, Jamie, you just raised about the character of Greek city-states, and each of these hermetic little city-states had a kind of personality. Mm-hmm. And so what is Xenophon interested in about Sparta, who, as you say, you know, for the first time was lost its own myth of invincibility, mm-hmm. at the moment when the myth of invincibility of the band was rising. Yes. So why is Xenophon a pivotal figure, not just as a source, but as a sort of a way to think about these issues, I guess? Mm-hmm.
Yes, well, Xenophon's not strictly a historian. The Greeks called him a philosopher. He studied with Socrates, and he wrote Socratic dialogues, just as Plato did.
Right.
And he's deeply interested in moral philosophy. And in his Socratic dialogues, he speaks often about what the Greeks called enkrateia, self-restraint, self-control, as the primary virtue, the governing virtue from which all other virtues spring. And for him, the Spartans were the models of self-restraint. They kept the pleasures of the body, food, wine, luxury goods, all that was kept out of their society. They forced themselves to undergo physical hardship. They built themselves up into, you know, supermen by virtue of privation, asceticism. And that to him was the great virtue of the moral character. So he attached himself to the Spartans. He fought under them, and he lived at Sparta for a time, and his children were educated at Sparta, his sons.
But then so since we're talking about the sort of ethics and cultural personality, Xenophon is an Athenian, mm-hmm. product of the highest level of, at the highest moment of Athenian culture. So, you know, there's a famous passage in Thucydides where, you know, he says if way in the future people were to try to sort of extrapolate from the physical remains of Sparta and Athens their relative importance in history, Sparta would look like relatively nothing because they didn't build acropolises and all of the stuff that we associate with Athens. So why would an Athenian, what does that mean about Athens at this, by the time we get to the 4th century, why would a well-bred upper class Athenian who's been exposed to the best of sort of, as it were, liberal arts culture of Athens be looking at the Spartans? Is there, you know, I think because a lot of the story you're telling is about the decline of the civilization ultimately. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about Chaeronea as soon as we get through this issue. But, you know, there's always this sense I have with Xenophon that it's somehow a comment on a late stage civilization. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, there was a counter reaction within Athens against the elite intellectual culture and the culture of consumer capitalism, as we would now call it.
Right.
There were Laconists, admirers of Sparta, living in Athens, who would go around with their short hair, their long hair, and their ragged cloaks and their sour expressions. Plutarch describes this, and trying to push for a more Spartan way of life. So Athens was not, you know, a homogeneous culture. It had political factions, just as we do.
Of course.
And Xenophon belonged to the Laconist faction, the Spartophile faction.
I mean, it's interesting, given the, you know, the sort of much more well-known conflict between Athens and Sparta, you know, that Thebes becomes this dynamic, successful player for almost half a century. And yet, aside from what you've already told us about the sort of perceptions of the Theban persona, you know, what was Theban culture? You know, it's like, you know, like, if you're going to be a hegemon, what are you selling? You know?
Well, that was a huge part of their problem, is that they had no reputation, they had no model of ethical greatness that they could hold up to the other Greeks.
It's interesting, right? I mean, when you're pulling back and thinking about history in a very large way, you know, that the Athenians certainly had a sense of what they were selling to the people that they were dominating. You know, there's so much evidence about that. I'm interested in this because this will take us now to the end of the Sacred Band, and the end of a lot else, as far as I'm concerned. You know, the traditional convenient date for the end of the classical period in Greece is Alexander the Great. But I always think that Chaeronea in 338, which is the end of the Sacred Band, is really the death knell, because there is a culture brewing that has the energy, the self-conviction, and the raw ambition that seems to have drained out of these other Greek city-states, and that's way up north. So maybe you want to now take us through who I'm talking about, why that's a whole different model that's going to change everything, and how that ended the Sacred Band.
Okay. Yes. So you're speaking about the Macedonians, who may or may not have been Greek, but the Greeks certainly considered them non-Greek, or many of them did. And they began amassing huge military power under Philip, the father of Alexander. And by 338, the time of Chaeronea, they posed an enormous threat to the freedom of central Greece. They showed that they were determined to control events in Greece, if necessary, by force. So Thebes was in kind of a middle position. It was not clear that it would fight against Macedon on the side of Athens. Athens and Macedon were clearly butting heads and were about to go to war. And Thebes was somewhat caught in the middle. But they chose to fight with Athens, even though Philip offered them very generous terms to stay on his side. And that,
Philip,
I think,
I'm just going to interrupt. Philip had a little history in Thebes, right?
Yes, he did. Yes. He had lived at Thebes as a teenager in the time of the great days of Theban power. And he learned some of his lessons, both militarily and leadership, from the Thebans. Mm-hmm.
So now he's starting to have big plans.
Yes. It's clear that he wants to dominate central Greece and that he might very well force them to knuckle under to some kind of empire or league. And Athens was determined to prevent that. Thebes wavered a bit, could have taken Philip's side, but took Athens' side instead. And the two cities went to war at Chaeronea in 338.
And can you just expand a little about why they made what turns out to be this terrible, fatal choice? Given the very complicated and antagonistic history with Athens, that's always a fascinating part of this story, because this alliance with Athens would be the end of this Theban moment. So why would they do, the Greeks, they're always fighting and they coalesce at the worst possible moments.
So we have very little evidence because the Thebans left nothing. They left none of their own writings that survive. We have a speech of Demosthenes in which he takes sole credit. I convinced the Thebans with my glorious rhetoric to stay on the Athenian side.
Right.
Recently, another speech has come to light from another orator, which shows that this was not the case, that the Thebans were in fact indecisive for a long time. It's really kind of inexplicable. The one historian who's done the most work on this era, John Buckler, said, and I quote this sentence in my book, that there's no historical logic to their decision.
Right.
They had much more to gain by siding with Philip against Athens. They had every reason to do so, and yet they chose not to. And I think the only explanation is that they wanted to preserve democracy and the autonomy of the city-states. They thought that would be threatened by the Macedonians.
Okay, so now tell the story of Chaeronea, the battle, the aftermath, the legends.
So the battle was a total wipeout. The Macedonians made short work of the combined armies of Athens and Thebes. There were 35,000 or more on each side. It was a huge confrontation, but was decided very quickly. And Alexander was posted opposite the Sacred Band. And I'm fairly sure that his orders were clear that these were the standard bearers of Greek freedom, and they had to be utterly destroyed as a way to show the Greeks that there was no resistance to Macedonian power. And Alexander managed to cut them off from the rest of the line and destroy them entirely. All 300 died on the spot and were buried on the spot, which was a high honor for Greek soldiers to be buried on the battlefield. And the mass grave underneath the Lion of Chaeronea are their remains.
So talk about, and this is 338. So the Sacred Band has basically existed for 40 glorious years, give or take. So now let's shift gears a little, pull back, and we're now in the early 19th century. So Chaeronea, 338, this resounding battle, after which Philip and Macedon are invincible. And that really paves the way for the career of Alexander, ultimately.
Yes.
Because it's obviously crucial for Philip to consolidate his hold over mainland Greece in order to further his larger plans, which are looking to the east. So now I want to go to the great story of, so you made a reference just now, Jamie, to the Lion of Chaeronea, but I'm not sure people know what that is. So maybe talk about that and the ancient sources for it and the mystery of it and its rediscovery and how that leads to the present moment.
So it's a crouching lion. It's about 16 feet tall and made of marble, magnificent object. It was erected probably about 20 years after the battle as a way to commemorate the Sacred Band. It was placed right over their mass grave. And then over the centuries fell apart and became buried. And in the early 19th century, a British traveler happened to stumble upon one of the stones, dug up the lion's head, and in the early 20th century, the Greeks reconstructed it, and it stands today in Chaeronea. It's absolutely magnificent. And in the course of reconstructing it, the ground underneath was excavated, and then the skeletons of the band were found underneath.
And there's one of the most startling things in Jamie's book is a reproduction of the site drawings of the mass grave, where you can see very clearly these skeleton or bodies had been lined up, or were, and you pointed it out to me. It's a very beautiful drawing. Some of them seem like they're holding hands in death. And I think that story of the discovery is just such an exciting story because there are ancient references like Pausanias, an ancient geography, who refers to this great monument that had been erected, and then it disappears. And this young British architect goes horseback riding, stumbles over a stone, and that's that. That's a moment, I think, to end on or not end, but start winding down on a question. It is June. It is Gay Pride Month. It is interesting. We began by talking about the fact that you couldn't believe, and I remember when you first mentioned this idea to me, about doing a book about it, I couldn't believe that nobody had written a book about this either. And, it is, on top of everything else, and what you've said tonight makes clear, I think, what an exciting, crucial, and pivotal moment that part of the 4th century is that most people really don't know about. Educated people will at least know what the Peloponnesian War is. And nobody knows about this stuff, which in a way, is part of a very decisive moment in the whole history of the Mediterranean. Why has there not been a book about it? But is there some sense that it just seems like such a great book for now, to have someone be able to talk about this as a historian, someone who's, unembarrassed by the gay factor. I always wonder whether that was an issue, at earlier points, because you are a person, I think this needs to be clear, I'm sure people already know it, who are writing for a mass audience in all of your books, really, as I hate the word popularizer, but somebody who's bringing this abstruse material in a very clear and lively way. But one has to ask oneself why this story, it's so irresistible. And I remember when you first brought it up, and I would mention to people, mutual friends, I said, oh, there was this band and blah, blah, blah. And people look at you open mouthed, right? They never heard of it. And I think it's interesting to speculate about why this is the first, general book about this subject.
Yeah, well, Xenophon did a good job. He covered a lot. He covered a lot of this stuff up, and he left us very little evidence. And then we got further robbed of evidence when Plutarch's Life of Epaminondas was lost from the Parallel Lives. Plutarch was himself Boeotian from the area around Thebes.
Of course.
And he wrote his very first pair of lives included the life of Epaminondas, who was the great leader of Thebes in this period. And that was somehow dropped from the collection and lost over the course of its transmission. So we're missing two big pieces of evidence, in contrast to the Peloponnesian War, where we have Thucydides and we have this glorious narrative. And of course, everybody wants, the great writer and the great evidence. And it's just easier to understand stories that have two combatants, right. Sparta against Athens. But the 4th century is a more multipolar world. It gets complicated. I've tried to keep it very clear and intelligible, but let's face it, it's more complicated.
Well, I have to say you do a very good job because, as I mentioned, I read the Xenophon last summer, and it wasn't until I read the galleys of your book that I had the kind of aha moments where I was sort of able to piece it together. It is an incredibly complicated moment, but, as I think you've made clear, it is the final moment. The Peloponnesian War, which everyone knows about, is not. This is really the final moment of this particular phase of this entire civilization, which is obviously so foundational. And therefore, your examination of it, I think, is really helpful to give people, everything didn't stop when Athens was defeated by Sparta at the end of the Peloponnesian War. But this is sort of the bridge period to the Macedonian moment, at which point everything changes. And I think that really comes out in the book. I have a question, which is just a kind of out of personal writerly curiosity. You are one of very few people who knows how to write about classical material for a wide audience of non-specialists. And I thought people might just be interesting. This is your, 4th book, where you're bringing these kind of stories to, ordinary intelligent readers who are not specialists. Mm-hmm. And I know you have an interesting background, and I always think it had a lot to do with why you end up doing this so well. Just so as a writer, why do you like to do that? A lot of classicists are working, publishing in scholarly venues, scholarly books, scholarly publications. What is it that made you want to sort of go out there into the world? And what, if anything, in your own background do you think allowed you to do that?
It feels to me like it's storytelling, or it's journalism, really. And I started off my career as a journalist.
Right.
I was in journalism for a couple of years. It's just wonderful to be able to tell people things that they didn't know. Interesting things.
Like teaching.
That, you get to share these interesting. My favorite Greek writer is Herodotus, because he tells you things. He's like your grandfather, the ideal grandfather who's got a million stories. So I just regarded it as storytelling, and I try to tell it as clearly and as interestingly as I can.
Yeah, well, I think this book, as you know, I was a fan of the idea from the get-go, especially when I learned, which I hadn't known, that there isn't a book like this about this incredibly interesting moment and incredibly interesting phenomenon, which is the Sacred Band. So I think you should be very pleased with the result. I can't believe it's already 7:45. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if it might not be a good idea to open the floor to maybe some audience questions. Mm-hmm.
Whoops, hang on a sec.
I see a question from Karen Sullivan. Shall I read and answer it?
Whoops, hang on a second, 1 second.
That's okay. I think we're okay. Yeah. Well, I'll do it. So,
Okay.
is that Karen? That I can't see. Hi, Karen.
Yes, it's Karen Sullivan.
Okay. So, doesn't Plato say something about how the band of lovers can never be defeated? Was he talking about these Thebans? And if so, what does that reflect about how people at the time saw them?
So there's a great question.
It's not me.
Not me either, I don't think.
That's so weird.
Maybe it was Karen. No, that can't be. So that's a great question. Plato's Symposium does have a hypothesis that if a band of an army were formed from pairs of lovers, they'd be able to defeat any foe, even an army much greater in number. And that was written about the same time that the Sacred Band was formed. One can't be certain whether he's referring to the Sacred Band. He couldn't call them by name because the dramatic time of the work, the setting, is 30 years before it was written, a time when the Sacred Band didn't exist. So he couldn't have named them. And I discuss this in the book, and I sort of suggest that it seems like he was talking about the Thebans, but it can't be proven. If he was, then it certainly shows his admiration for what the Thebans had achieved, because he talked about them in very positive terms.
Yeah, I know that. I can say, and here, Karen and everybody else, I'll wrap this around. I know personally, just from years of writing about gay culture and gay literature, that the Sacred Band, in a kind of closed pre-Stonewall moment, became something that people rallied to. The idea, particularly at a more primitive moment in how people thought about gay people, that gay men could be these great, valorous heroes. I remember reading someplace that in World War II, closeted gay soldiers and seamen would share this passage, that passage in the symposium, and that became a sort of a cultural secret. So I do think there is something very compelling, the idea, because, and I think, just to clarify, why would a band of lovers be invincible? Because no one would want to ever display cowardice before his beloved. That would be the greatest shame. And it's such a great ringing concept,
Yes.
There's another question I see. It may be an obvious idea, but it seems that the general homophobia of the world really has kept the truths of the Sacred Band from common knowledge. Thank you for this conversation. Yeah, I was getting at that before. I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah, and I want to just mention that the book has several vignettes from the 19th century when homosexuality was first being acknowledged by the European world, especially in England, and also was subject to all kinds of oppression. And several prominent writers and thinkers, including Walt Whitman, were deeply inspired by the story of the Sacred Band. It gave them a sense that this was a valid lifestyle and led in some ways to the first gay liberation movement. Yeah.
There's another question. Am I understanding correctly that the members of the band coupled before they joined the band? Oops.
They were couples, I think is what it's meant. Yes. Yes, I think they must have been recruited as couples. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, right. One would assume as much. Well, there's the other possibility is they get 300. It's like a giant speed dating. Get 300 random Theban guys, throw them in a barracks together, and see how it comes out.
There is a question in one of the other boxes here. Someone asks, If members of the band were buried holding hands, can it be called a mass grave? And if Thebes was a Greek backwater, why was it the subject of so much Athenian drama?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question.
Great. No, they're great questions.
Great questions.
Yeah, so to take the second one first, the portrayal of Thebes in Athenian drama is fairly negative. It's in many ways a failed city.
Right.
Its leadership is a mess, incestuous and internecine murders and ancestral curses, and it's civil war. So in some ways it was the anti-Athens. Daniel's, the advisor that Daniel and I shared, has written importantly about this. And Thebes and Athens were enemies during the whole period when those dramas were written. So in some ways Thebes is being demonized as a failed society.
Right. And there's all, the sense also that the idea is that, all Athenian tragedy, which is all Greek tragedy, is somehow really about Athens, thinking about Athens, but displacing onto the other city. So Thebes in so many ways, political, militarily, but also literarily, becomes a kind of space of otherness that you can write about. And I think, when Jamie and I were in grad school together, that this advisor of ours from Zeitlin was working up a series of important pieces about this. Why is it always set in Thebes if it's really about Athenian concerns?
Yeah.
Very interesting subject and a great question.
Yeah. The other question, I'm not quite sure I understand. If they're holding hands, can it be called a mass grave? The formation is very tight. Certain pairs seem to be linked, but the formation is very tight, and it's that of an infantry phalanx. 7 rows, the standard depth was 8. Perhaps there's an 8th row beyond the perimeter that was excavated. Mm-hmm. But it's clear that they were meant to be buried as they stood in battle as a phalanx.
And you might say another word, Jamie, because I can count on 2 fingers, to my knowledge, but you know more than I do, the number of sites where the soldiers were buried, where they fell.
Well, there were the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, the 300 that we know from the movies. That was the other great example, and that burial mound is still a major memorial in modern day Greece.
Yeah. So I was just bringing it up to give people a sense of how remarkable this event was seen in its own time. I mean, this is a signal and extremely unusual honor.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And then to have the lion erected over the grave is even more honorific.
And I think Pausanias says erected to signify the special honor attached to the place. Mm-hmm. Not just the burial, but the statue.
And the statue doesn't have an inscription, which is very unusual and quite moving, really, because it assumes that everyone knew who was under there and what it meant.
Yeah. And now they'll know better.
Do you see other questions, Noelle?
I do. We have one more question, which is a question that I had because you said that the span of the Sacred Band was about 40 years. So this person asks, do we know how long they cycled in and out? What was the general time span of service in the Sacred Band? Like how many generations of men were in it?
That's a great question. We don't know about the band itself, but the Spartans considered 60 the end of military service.
I should hope so.
And but remarkably, the men who fought under Alexander the Great were still actively fighting in their 70s. Plutarch calls attention to that. So age was not, a disqualifier in the way that it is often today. It's thinkable that the original group, some of the men that were drafted in their 20s or at 20, were still serving at Chaeronea, but more likely there was a rotational, retirements being replaced by new draftees, at least in part.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
I'm sure that someone could do an analysis of the skeletons and determine.
I was just going to say.
And determine what age they were at death. I don't know if that's been done, actually.
But Jamie, actually, do you know what is the state of the site?
So the site has been reinterred. The skeletons have been reinterred, and if you go there today, you just see a smooth grass surface with a perimeter wall around it. But there are 4 or 5 skeletons that were retained above ground, and studies are sometimes done on those. And those are quite interesting because they show the kind of wounds and fractures that were incurred in the battle, and some of them are quite horrifying.
I know we only have 2 minutes left, but you might say a word about why Philip's fighting machine was revolutionary. Why he was able to, I know Alexander was a good fighter, but didn't Philip have a new military technology that completely changed the game?
He introduced a new weapon, the sarissa, a 17 or 18 foot lance that was held with 2 hands. And this was a much more fearsome infantry weapon than the Greek thrusting spear, which was only held with 1 hand. It was only 7 or 8 feet long. So big spears, that'll win the battle for you.
You wouldn't want to see that coming at you. Yeah.
Okay, I have one last question, and then I have a question, actually. Someone asks, does the lion symbolize something specific for the Greeks beyond a symbol of bravery?
Well, of course, there are lions everywhere that often symbolize bravery. The crouching lion which is not attacking prey or rearing or roaring, but crouching and gazing off in the distance, that is a different kind of monument that suggests a monument of defeat, a memorial of a defeated army.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. And then my last question, as Daniel pointed out, this is such a great story. And like Daniel, I had never heard of it before. I literally took your book out of a box. I think I saw the advanced copy of it and I was like, what is this? And then it's such an amazing story. And in relating this to others, which is why your book is so great, do you plan on teaching this to your students? Is this a story that you talk to your students about, or younger people in classes? Is it one of those stories that gets attention? I don't know. Is that something? Oh
yeah, no, it certainly gets attention. I use it as a prelude to the story of Alexander. Students, some reason, even in this day and age when warfare and conquest are not very fashionable, students are still fascinated by Alexander the Great. So I teach him every other year, and the Sacred Band is part of that course.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, wow. Someone says, thank you so much for a powerful and moving conversation. And I thank you both as well. This has been so great and such an inspiring discussion. And if anyone wants to buy the book, like I said, there's the little green button at the bottom. Definitely want to check it out. And of course, if you want to pop in the store, both of our locations have expanded hours now. So you can come anytime from 11 to 6 and, get James's book yourself. So thank you so much. And I also want to express our thanks to Michelle Chung from Simon & Schuster for making this event possible. We really appreciate it. And thank all of you readers out there in our Oblong community for joining us tonight. And take care and be well. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Good night.
Good
Night.